Okay, everyone, we're going to start on lecture 19 today. So the last third, this quarter seems to have gone really fast. And we've sort of dealt with the geosphere, we've dealt with the hydrosphere, we've dealt with the atmosphere. And what we're going to do with the last bit of the course is look at the biosphere. Not so much looking at individual species, but instead we're going to be thinking about how the biosphere influences the larger Earth system. So how does it influence the atmosphere? How does it influence the hydrosphere? So a couple of things today. You'll notice that I'm afraid I don't like the way that the biosphere is laid out in the textbook. So I tend to jump around a lot. So I have put up the reading for today, which is taken from actually a couple of chapters. So I'm afraid you'll have to jump around a bit with the reading. But for me, it makes more logical sense in this order. You can argue with me if you like. Quiz 7 should be easier this week because it's only on today's lecture. Okay, so I can only ask so many questions and they should hopefully be easier to find. But it's open until 1 p.m. on Monday as usual. The lecture notes for Monday won't be posted until quite late on Sunday, and that's because I am going away on a field trip, which is very exciting. I'm taking my other class to Joshua Tree National Park for the weekend, so I'm not going to have email contact, so please don't expect a response from me in the next 3 days, okay? So they'll be up on the website just slightly later than normal if you would like to print them to bring them on Monday. Does anyone have questions for me before I move on? No? Good. Right. So, easy question of the day. Which of these images is something alive? It's all right, you don't need an iClicker for this. Which one is the alive one? The dog, thank you. Okay. So now I have a second question for you. Is it alive? Are they alive? What are they? Potatoes. Are potatoes alive? Who thinks yes? Who thinks no? A few brave people. It's something that it's actually a bit more difficult to define, right? Because usually we see as living things as sort of moving, as growing. And these are more sort of dormant. So as long as you haven't left them in your cupboard for sort of a year or more, as long as they haven't dried out completely, if we planted these would to start growing again. So they're technically living, but they're perhaps dormant. And you can get dead potatoes, which are the ones that sort of liquefy and go everywhere. So there are certain fundamental characteristics of life. Okay? It's how we define what life is. And to be honest with you, it's a bit of a sort of a gradation. There's definitely grey areas there, which are really fascinating to me, at least, in how we define what is actually alive or not. And these are some of those characteristics. We're going to look at just 4 of these characteristics. We're going to look at metabolism, and that's basically all of the chemical reactions that life is carrying out in order to sort of produce energy or to provide us with energy, okay? We have growth, so a consistent ordering of the atoms and molecules, okay? We sort of build up different organization. And so things like crystals, they grow, they sort of align, they add sort of atoms onto themselves in a very systematic, organized way, but they're not alive. Okay, because they don't fulfill these other basic requirements. Reproduction, so either through cell division for simpler organisms or sexual or asexual reproduction in more complicated organisms such as us. Okay, and then we get into sort of dodgy area with viruses, because viruses can't necessarily replicate by themselves. They use other cells in order to do this. And the same thing for metabolism. They sort of borrow other people's. So viruses are that sort of shady area between alive and not alive. And then lastly, and we're going to spend Monday's lecture talking about this, is evolution. So the idea that through various biological processes, genetic changes occur in populations, and we get new species as a result of that at the end. And it's sometimes difficult to say what makes a species, So our definition for a particular species is usually something that can't interbreed with other populations. If it can't interbreed anymore, then it becomes a separate population. So dogs, even though they're vastly different sizes and shapes and everything else, logistically it's a challenge, but they can all interbreed and produce sort of hybrid versions, which then can also interbreed, whereas if we have things like donkeys and horses, then their offspring are usually sterile, and so we can't create new populations with that genetic makeup. So we'll talk much, much more about evolution on Monday, but we'll focus today on some of these others. So before we get into the detail for each of those, we need to come up with some way that we organize life. Because it's actually quite a challenge to organize the huge variety that we have. And so we have a sort of hierarchy here. And I've put in bold the ones that we're going to deal with in this class in particular. So things like cells. Cells are really the basic building block of life. So in the same way that atoms make up sort of chemicals, so elements and compounds and molecules, cells are what make up life. Okay. And then we have a whole bunch of things in between, but then we have organisms. Okay, organisms are individual creatures of some sort, or individual little single-celled organisms. And so we're interested in what happens to those. Populations are groups of organisms. And so I could have a population of deer in America, I could have a population of deer in Europe, or a population of deer in the UK. And as long as they're genetically the same species, then they'd be called the same or different populations of the same species. If evolution happens differently on those different continents, and we end up with enough genetic change that those different populations can't breed anymore, then we'd have different species going on. And then lastly, and what Earth system science tends to look at, is the big scale. We tend to look at things like ecosystems. And ecosystems are all of the different species that are interacting in a certain area, but also actually the non-living part of that system. So things like the atmosphere, things like the soil, and things like how much water there is. Those things actually define an ecosystem just as much as the species do. And then lastly, we have biomes. And biomes are really when we group all of these ecosystems together. So for example, the tropical rainforest is an example of a biome. We might get slightly different sort of ecosystems on different continents, but in general, we can group them together as a rainforest. The desert is a biome. Tundra is a biome. All of these things are grouped. Okay. So those are the things that we're going to, or the terminology that I might use in the next few lectures. So let's look a little bit more in detail at cells, because we have two different types of cells. And we have what we call prokaryotic cells. And these are cells that have no nucleus. And so the DNA that's stored in that cell isn't in a nice organized part. It's actually sort of in just loosely within the cell. Okay. Then we have eukaryotic cells, which is what we are made of. And our DNA is nicely centrally organized in a nucleus. And so that's the difference there. Which do you think probably evolved first? Prokaryotes. They're simpler. Okay? Anything that's multicellular will be a eukaryote. So all plants, all animals, all fungi are going to be eukaryotic. Okay? And so we do have some single-celled organisms. In fact, we have an awful lot of unicellular organisms. It's not the ones we see, obviously, but the ones that we're most interested in often are eukaryotes. Okay. And here's our animals, or not our animal kingdom, our 6 kingdoms. So another way that we can organize life is in this sort of hierarchy of kingdoms. And you can see that we have 3 that are unicellular. So we have our unicellular prokaryotic eubacteria, and so that's all the things that cause nasty diseases, but also some healthy bacteria, all that healthy bacteria that yogurt companies tell you is in their yogurt. And then we have archaeobacteria, which again are unicellular and prokaryotic, and those are our microbes. And then we have protista, so zooplankton, which is basically the little creatures that float around in the surface ocean and eat other things. Okay, so that's our zooplankton. Red-brown algae, so they're more sort of photosynthesizing type organisms. And those have got to the eukaryotic stage. They're slightly more complicated, and so they can do more complicated things. And then the things that we tend to see at the surface today, which is the fungi, the plants, and the animals. All of those are multicellular and eukaryotic. And the vast majority of all the diversity of life isn't in the top three. It's in those bottom three. It's in those unicellular things that we don't necessarily see. And so this is sort of a more familiar idea of how we characterize life, because within each of those kingdoms, we can then break it down into phylum, class, order, species, etc. And so this is just an example of us, Homo sapiens. So that's our species, is sapiens, but our genus is Homo. And that's because we had a number of different types of species in the past that were related to us, but we couldn't necessarily interbreed with. So things like the Neanderthals overlapped with us for quite some time in Europe, but the evidence is patchy about whether there was interbreeding or not. People seem to suggest there is. And so you can see that we have this sort of systematic way of organizing life. But we're really not going to worry much about this, because we're not necessarily interested in individual organisms necessarily. We're interested in how life affects the Earth. Okay. So this is just to make sure that we're on the same page. So, what is the ultimate source of all of your energy? So we're going to start talking more about metabolism again. So what is the ultimate source of the energy? What allows me to, well, not dance around today because I'm still sick, but usually prance around on the stage at the front? Okay, has everyone had a chance to answer? Okay, let's take a look. So, oh, you guys are too clever for me, so I didn't catch anyone out. So it's definitely the sun, because even if we eat a nice steak tonight or something, that cow would have fed on plants, and how did those plants get their energy? It's from the sun. So let's talk about metabolism. So let's talk about how this sort of chemical reactions that allow us to produce energy. So first of all, we can split it into two groups. We have autotrophs. Autotrophs can create their own food, so they're self-feeders, almost autotrophs. And then in a second, we're going to look at heterotrophs, which each eat other things. Okay. And so autotrophs are things that can make organic molecules just using energy. And so we can do that using energy from the sun, which is our photoautotrophs. Can anyone think of an example of a photoautotroph? A plant. Okay, yes. All plants will be photoautotrophs. And also we have this second process, this chemoautotrophs. And can you imagine a setting on Earth that we've mentioned a couple of times now, where this might be the way that energy is provided to a system? You guys remember this. Where do you think the sun won't be as important, but where do we have life going on that's separated? Ah, the deep sea. Do you remember we talked about those hydrothermal vent communities, which are actually operating entirely differently from the surface? They're not getting their energy from the sun. They're actually getting their energy from the chemicals being released in this really nice hot water. So yes. So absolutely, our example is our lovely plant. And our plants will photosynthesize. We'll take carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, we'll combine that with water, but we also need this input of sunlight to provide energy. And then we produce simple sugars, so simple carbohydrates. And this is sort of the simplest sugar we have, sort of glucose, and oxygen. And this is our process of photosynthesis, and it's extremely important for the Earth in general. And it's worth saying that those chemoautotrophs are a tiny, tiny, tiny fraction of what actually produces carbohydrates on Earth. Really, it's the photosynthesis process that generates most of the biomass on Earth. So we now have heterotrophs. So heterotrophs can't produce their own food using energy from elsewhere. They actually have to obtain organic molecules by decomposing or by consuming something else. Okay? Can you think of an example? A wolf over here, yes, absolutely. A wolf would do this. We do this, okay? We're heterotrophs. And so definitely my little caterpillar here is a heterotroph. It is consuming that lovely plant material that sort of photoautotrophs produce. And in doing so, it takes in that carbohydrate that was produced in photosynthesis, those glucose and the other more complicated carbohydrates. But it also requires oxygen, and then that produces energy which it can use for life and for growth and for reproduction. Oh, I made a mistake in my slides. This shouldn't say CH2O. What should it say? What should it say? CO2 and H2O. Okay. So you have to let me off this week because I'm sick. Okay. So we basically do that photosynthesis process, but in reverse. So with our photosynthesis, we're taking carbon dioxide, water, and sunlight, and energy from sunlight, and we're producing glucose and oxygen. With respiration, which is what we do, we're taking in that carbohydrate, we're combining it with oxygen, and we're getting out energy that we can use, and then we breathe out water and carbon dioxide, okay? So there's our heterotrophs. So my question for you is, do plants respire? So what do you think? Do plants respire? Do they go through this respiration process, this opposite of photosynthesis? A few more seconds. Okay. They do indeed. Everyone obviously took lots of biology at school. Okay, so yes, plants do respire. So yes, they photosynthesize, but then they use those carbohydrates, those sugars that they produce, to grow or to reproduce. So here we have our respiration process again, and this time it's the right way around. And so definitely we undergo this process. We take in sugars to produce our energy, but also plants will use some of what they produce to produce energy, okay? And that's going to be important when we come back to this later in the lecture. And so we want to talk about energy transfer. So we definitely take this energy from the sun. For the vast majority of life on Earth, it's coming from the sun, and our plants use that energy to produce simple sugars and carbohydrates, and then our little mouse will eat the plants and it will use that energy, and then our snake can eat the mouse and it will use some of that energy, and it goes all the way through the what we call the food chain until we get to our decomposers at the end. Okay? So this is our food chain, this sort of system where things will eat everything else. In reality, food chains are nice and simple. We get something more like that, okay? We get more food webs than food chains because it's pretty rare to get something that is just preyed upon by one thing. And so in reality, these things are often more complex, but the same basic principles apply. So we're going to stick with the more simple version today rather than try and look at this sort of process, okay? So we refer to the different sort of how far you are away, really, from that source of energy in terms of trophic levels, okay? And so if you are the first trophic level, you're basically a photoautotroph. You're a plant, you're producing your own sort of carbohydrates using that energy. And so what we call these is the producers. Often we call these the primary producers. So if we tend to talk about primary production, we're talking about these photoautotrophs. And then we go to our second trophic level, which is going to be the primary consumer. Then we go to our third trophic level, the secondary consumer, et cetera, until we get to our fungi and things that will decompose. These are our decomposers, unsurprisingly, where they break down this organic matter and return that to the soil. Okay? So, here's my little frog. It is a happy frog, apart from the fact that it's being bitten by a mosquito. So that mosquito is biting that frog, it's getting blood from that frog, and so it's obtaining organic material that it can then break down. But then my frog is eating my mosquito. So my question for you is, would the frog get the same amount of energy from eating that mosquito that the mosquito got from biting the frog? No. So we have a definite answer at the front, but how about the rest of you? Few more seconds. Okay. They agree with you. So, yeah, absolutely, it won't get the same amount of energy. Why? Heat. Okay, absolutely, because when that mosquito is flying around and when it's consuming that, that sort of organic material, it's releasing energy. It's converting that sort of stored chemical energy in that carbohydrate into something it can use. But as it moves, it's going to generate heat, and that energy then escapes from the system. It's not going to be returned to the frog when it eats. And this is why we can't have little closed systems like this. And this sort of basically follows the laws of thermodynamics, which is that energy can't be created or destroyed. That's our first law. So energy can't be created or destroyed. But the real point of this is law 2, which is that it usually changes, or it always changes from a more useful form. So in our case, our nice, organized, orderly carbohydrates and sugars into a less useful form, into heat. Okay? And that can't then be turned back. It can't then necessarily be easily turned back from heat into the more chemical form again. So really what we have going on in most ecosystems and in most of biological processes, we have energy coming in from the sun. It's being used up in that life, and it's escaping away, it's dissipating away in the form of heat. Okay? So energy coming in from the sun, being used and recycled to a certain extent, but then it sort of seeps away in the form of heat. And so you're right that at each stage of this process, those organisms are producing heat, and so at each stage, more energy is lost. And what that means is that we can't take all of the material and the energy that's used in that first trophic level and transfer it to the end. Okay. What happens is that we lose energy as we go up through each trophic level. Okay. So each time we're losing a bit of heat energy. The other reason is that it's just really difficult for us to perfectly consume all of the primary producers, because in order to get all of the energy from that into our next trophic levels, we'd have to eat every shred of the primary producers, and our digestive systems aren't just that efficient, and we usually don't do that. So what we see is that we see less biomass as we go up in the trophic levels. And people sometimes confuse this with, well, the organisms are just bigger and so there's fewer of them. It's not, well, certainly that is the case, but actually if you add up, if you took the weight of all of those organisms, then you actually see a decrease in what we call biomass in the weight of that sort of biological material at that different trophic level. So we obviously have the most biomass in our primary producers, in sort of grass or other plant material. Our primary consumers can eat that, and they only have lost energy at one trophic level so far from respiration from plants. And so we have quite a lot of biomass in our primary consumers, but then our toads aren't perfectly efficient at eating our primary consumers, and those primary consumers also lost energy. And so we lose energy, and so we lose biomass as we move up through the trophic levels. It's not just because the animals are bigger. So I said that the fact that our plants respire is going to come back and be important towards the end today. And so we're going to look now at the growth and production. So we've dealt with metabolism, we've dealt with the energy moving through food chains. So now let's think about how we go about measuring growth and production on a big, giant scale. We're not interested in how much one little tree grew last year. What we're interested in is much larger scale. And so the amount of usable energy in the ecosystem sets the upper limit on how much growth can occur. Okay. So I mentioned primary production earlier because we have our primary producers, our plants. And primary production is equal to all of the carbohydrates, all of the sugars produced by by those autotrophs, so by photosynthesis mostly. But just like you get a gross income and a net income for all you business people out there, we see the same thing with primary production, because we're not necessarily interested as much in the gross primary production, which is if we just add up all of the carbohydrates, all of the sugars produced by those autotrophs, that's our gross primary production. What we're perhaps more interested in is the net primary production. So all of that gross primary production minus the respiration that is happening. So how much extra biomass are we basically adding to the system each year? Okay, so just like our gross income minus what we spend will be our net. Okay, so the gross income is everything, and the net is the difference between that total minus the respiration, which remember plants will do as well. Okay, then we talk about secondary production. It's not something we'll talk as much about, but that's the body mass production by those heterotrophs instead. Okay. And really it's the net primary production we're interested in, because that's what sets the limit on how much of our secondary production can happen. So here's some more terms for you. Unfortunately, biology is a little bit like this. So I've mentioned the word biomass before, and I wanted to define it for you. So biomass is the total mass of living things in an ecosystem. And we usually express it in some sort of mass per unit area. So it's not going to be any good to you if I tell you there's 12 tons of biomass if I don't tell you over what sort of area that's spread. Okay, it could be very, very different. The net production is actually the growth that occurs in an ecosystem. And that's usually expressed per area and time. So how much was added to that 12,000 tons last year? Okay, was it 1 ton that was added, or was it another 1,200 tons? So that's our net production. And it's important for us, and it's especially important for when we're thinking about climate change and everything else, because we're looking, when we see net production going on, we're storing energy and we're storing carbon. So one of the things that people have suggested might help save us from overloading our atmosphere with too much carbon dioxide and causing climate change is, well, let's just plant lots of trees. And one of the quiz questions this week gets you to think through the maths of that and think about whether that's really a practical solution. But we're just generally interested in how much of the carbon that's in our atmosphere is getting cycled and stored in the biosphere. Okay? Is that carbon that gets stored in the biosphere, is that there permanently? Is it gone for good from the atmosphere? No, because what's going to happen to it sooner or later? Happens to us all sooner or later. We die, okay? it dies, and it will either get respired back into the atmosphere, or it will decay away and the decomposers will return that carbon. So some of it might get buried, but the vast majority of it returns. So yes, it will help us in the short term if we can get more of our carbon from the atmosphere into the biosphere, but it's not necessarily going to save us in the long term. So here's a beautiful picture of an area that was exposed to a fire, okay? And you can see that new growth is starting to happen now. So I want you to think about what is likely to happen to the biomass over the next sort of 2 decades, so the next 20 years or so, and what do you think will happen to the net production per year, okay? So have a chat with your neighbors and think about what might happen. Okay, last few seconds to think about it. Okay. Oh, we've got a clear winner, and let's see if they're right. So they are right. So that biomass has just, a lot of it has been destroyed by this fire. And so over the next 20 years, these new trees are likely to grow in, and so we're likely to increase the amount of biomass in that area. And the 60% are also right that the net production that happens each year will very much vary due to changing conditions. So if you have a really wet year, you might have more growth than in a really dry year. And so the biomass, the total biomass will increase through time, but how much of it gets added each year is likely to vary. Okay. And so that's what I've put on the slides just to make sure you have it in your notes. So here's the nice little image showing the net primary production in different areas of the world. And so on land, obviously, the greener the color, the more net primary production there is. The yellower, the less. And in the oceans also, we can look at sort of the greener colors are areas where there's more net primary production happening, and the bluer areas are those sort of more dead zones in our ocean. Okay. So I want you to talk to your neighbor for a second and think about where is primary production high and low on land, and what might the controls be on where that not high and low primary production is, and also whereabouts in the oceans. And don't just think about the surface ocean this time, think about the whole oceans. Think about where most of the biological activity is likely to be happening. So I'll give you sort of 2 or 3 minutes to talk about that, and then I'll ask for responses. Okay? Right, everyone? So have you got suggestions for me? So where do you think the most life, or where, let's start the other way around. Where is the least life on Earth? Where is the least net primary production happening? Sorry? High. Subtropical highs? Yeah, absolutely. Because what's located at our subtropical highs? Deserts. Okay, so what might be the limiting factor on life there? Water. Okay, this isn't complicated, I promise. So when you think about what controls net primary production, then think about your houseplant. I routinely kill off all of the plants that I try and grow, because usually there are certain things that I don't manage to provide. So what are the things that your plant in your house would need you to provide for it? Water, sunlight, fertilizer. And what does that fertilizer contain that it might need? Nutrients, absolutely. So basically those same limiting factors that allow you to kill off your houseplant if you don't provide them is what limits life on land. Okay, so you can see that in the polar regions we have dry conditions, but also it's just really cold, and plants don't do well where it's really cold. So temperature is a limiting factor in those sorts of regions. Around the deserts, the Sahara and inland, it's not that there's not enough sort of heat, but it's that there's just no water. So that's another limiting factor. In some places there might be enough of both, but perhaps we haven't got very thick soils, and that's a limiting factor as well. So all of these things can affect life on land. What do you think the main things are that affect life in the ocean? We already talked about one of them, which is Nutrients, okay, so that's why upwelling was so important, because it brings that nutrient-rich water back to the surface and allows life to happen again. But if we're thinking now about the whole of the ocean, why do we have lots of nutrients in the water in the deep ocean? Why is it not being used up? What is there not in the deep ocean that we would need for net primary production to happen? Sunlight, absolutely. It's dark. So we can have all of the nutrients we like down there, but if we don't have that sunlight in the deep ocean, we're not going to get life. Okay, so that's why most of our net primary production in the ocean happens in our nice surface ocean, and it happens especially where we have nutrients in the surface, so close to the coasts and also where we have upwelling. Okay, so hopefully that makes a little bit more sense now. So here's an interesting question. How much of the net primary production, so for the whole Earth, for all of the plants that are producing this sort of primary production, this carbohydrates and then things respiring, how much of it do we as humans use as either fuel or energy or for food? What do you think? Okay, a few more seconds. Right. Where's it gone? Oh, there it is. Come back. There we go. So we have a little bit of a draw. Okay. So this is a mean question because you really have no idea of knowing. But if you voted D, you are correct. There you go. So good guess. So isn't that, I think that's astounding, that of all of the carbohydrates produced by plants, if you take away the respiration that they do, we as humans use 20% of that each year. I think that's just an insane number. And obviously that isn't necessarily evenly distributed, because you can imagine that a lot of those areas on my map where we had lots of nice biological activity going on in net primary production, so like in the middle of Asia and sort of Siberia and parts of Russia, we don't have a lot of people. So actually, in a lot of the places in the world, we're using way over 100% of the local net primary productivity. How do we do that? Because we get our food imported. So in a lot of the areas where we have a huge population, we're using way more than we can actually produce locally. We have to get it transported in. And we're going to come back to this sort of question towards the end of the, I think, is it next week or the week after, what controls us. And so we're coming to the idea of the distribution of life, and this idea that there's limits on the amount of life that can happen. And we have two possibilities. There are actually a whole bunch of possibilities, but we're just going to talk about two. And that is the first, which is the physical environment, so things like how many nutrients there are, the climate, how much energy we're getting. That limits the amount of life on Earth. And then secondly, the competition of species controls the abundance of each species. Okay? So we'll deal with each of these in turn. So I wanted to talk briefly about population dynamics. So a population, do you remember, is just a group of individual organisms, and dynamics is just the same word for growth and change. So if we have all of the right conditions for life to exist, we get a curve that looks something more like that. It's an exponential increase. Okay? So life is quite happy, it continues to multiply, and so our population undergoes an exponential increase. Can you think of any organism on Earth which might be undergoing an exponential increase? Us. Humans, okay. We have done astounding things in terms of our population in just the last 100 years or so. So if you look back to sort of 1900, then we had probably about 1.5, definitely under 2 billion people on the planet. And this graph is somewhat out of date now, because if you project forward to today, we're over 7 billion. Over 7 billion. So we have massively changed in just the last sort of 100 years, and even just the last 50 years, we've almost doubled the impact that we have. And so we're obviously going to be affecting the biological activity on Earth, because if we're taking 20% of that net primary productivity, we're going to have a knock-on effect on all the other life that would otherwise have access to that. So definitely our human population is massively increasing. Will our population continue to grow like this for a while? Till we run out of stuff, absolutely. What might control our population? How many people could the Earth support? What sort of things might limit us? Fresh water, food. Probably not space, not so much, because we're very good at living crammed together. But definitely things like available space in terms of growing appropriate amounts of food. And so this is another idea we're going to come back to when we look at the human population, and we're going to look at how much of the fresh water supply we're currently using, and interesting questions like that. So this comes to the idea that in any sort of given area, then there's a limit to how many individuals that area can support. And that limit is called the carrying capacity. So instead of our exponential growth continuing and going on forever, our exponential growth will continue, and then as we get towards that limiting factor, the growth will slow, and it might even overshoot a little bit. In the quiz I have an example where it overshoots, but then it settles at a carrying capacity, which is the number of organisms that that area can reasonably support. Okay? And so that's an interesting idea, I think, is what is Earth's carrying capacity. And it's not just how many people could we support, but at what level of comfort, at what technological level, I think is a really interesting question. And this is the fundamental idea behind this. So for any population, there are limiting factors, whether that's temperature, whether that's a water supply, whether that's food. Well, not so much food, but and if we have too little of it, we don't have very many individuals. And often if we have too much of something, then we don't have very many individuals. So there's an optimum level, okay? So this is the effect that the physical environment, the climate, the other things can have on our population. So now I want to talk briefly about competition. And what type of organism this isn't important, it's planaria, but basically the idea behind this limiting factor is that two species that have the same growth requirements, that need the same temperature, nutrient content, sort of salinity of the ocean or something like that, cannot coexist in the same habitat. One of them will end up outcompeting the other. So you can see that if we just have either of these little planaria organisms in isolation, so this particular species would grow and sort of hit that carrying capacity after a few days. This other one would grow and hit that carrying capacity after a few days. If we try and grow them together, then you can see that that green line, the Aurelia, is outcompeting our poor red line, our caudatum. Okay? So this is the basic idea. And to be honest, this is the textbook example, which isn't particularly inspiring. I prefer the cute little squirrels. And we've basically got the invasion going the other way. We have your horrible North American gray squirrels invading the UK and pushing out our very cute but slightly stupid red squirrels, okay? And so, because they have the same growth requirements, but those gray squirrels tend to be a little bit larger, okay? And so they definitely have to compete. Where's everyone going? Okay, but if you have different ecological niches, so if you can have slightly different environments where those can succeed, you can do better, okay? And so here's an example, but also with my squirrels, my red squirrels will do better in pine forests, so that's where they tend to be left behind today, whereas the gray squirrels have taken over everything else. Okay, so on Monday, we'll talk about evolution and biological diversity.